Friends, members of the faculty, fellow cadets, and welcome visitors, welcome to tonight's debate. Tonight's event is a function of the Philosophy Forum under the financial auspices of the Department of English and the Chaplain's Office. We are grateful for their support. It is my distinct honor to introduce Dr. Louis Poyman. For those of us who have had the privilege of learning with him and working with him, these words will ring true. He is a consummate scholar, a prolific thinker, a great teacher, and a loyal professional. Dr. Poyman grew up in Cicero, Illinois in the 40s and 50s. He attended the Union Theological Seminary at Columbia University, from which he received a Master's of the Arts and the doctorate in philosophy and religion. In 1969, he was a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Copenhagen, and in 1970, he was a Rockefeller Fellow at Hamburg University. He received his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University in 1977. His first position was at the University of Notre Dame. He then went on to the University of Texas at Dallas and the University of Mississippi, where for 3 years he served as the chair of the Department of Philosophy and Religion. In 1995, he accepted an offer to become professor of philosophy at the United States Military Academy in West Point. He has recently been a visiting professor at Brigham Young University in Utah and a visiting fellow at Oxford University. He was also in the civil rights movement and served at 2 Reformed churches in New York City. He and his wife are avid outdoorsmen and cyclists. It is no uncommon occurrence to see him on his bike around campus, moving, of course, at breakneck speeds. Sadly, we cadets are enjoying our last semester under his instruction. He plans to retire this winter and will be sorely missed. Finally, I would like to draw your attention to a few things. First, for those yearlings agonizing over the choice of major, which will happen for the next 3 years, there's a pamphlet in the back describing the art, philosophy, and literature major. The Philosophy Forum is also providing a schedule of speakers for this year in the back of the auditorium. Also, this is a big event. Check your calendars. Leonard Peikoff, an Ayn Rand scholar, will be speaking on September 30th at 1930 in Thayer 144. And now please welcome a perennial favorite among cadets and a respected scholar among academics, Dr. Louis Poyman.
Thank you, John. First thing I want to do is recognize Captain Chris Mayer and thank him for the wonderful job he did organizing this presentation, this debate. Without his work behind the scenes, actually it was his idea to do this in the first place last spring, but without his work, this would not have happened. And so please join me in giving him a round of applause. Our 2 presenters this evening are Professor William Lane Craig, who is a noted scholar, and Professor Bruce Russell, who is the chair of the philosophy department at Wayne State University. First, let me say a few words about each of these scholars. William Lane Craig got his first degree from Wheaton College and then a MA from Trinity Evangelical Divinity School. He has 2 PhDs, one from the University of Munich in theology and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Birmingham. He has taught at Talbot Theological Seminary, at Westmont College, and at several other places in the United States. He is a noted speaker and writer. He is the author of 3 important books: Time and Eternity, The Kalam Cosmological Argument, and just out, God, a Debate, written with Walter Sinnott Armstrong, a debate between a Christian and an atheist. Professor Craig has been here before, and many of us have learned much from him. We read his material in our Philosophy of Religion book, and are very appreciative of his scholarship and his depth of understanding. Professor Bruce Russell got both his bachelor and his doctorate degree at the University of California at Davis. He has spent 28 years teaching at Wayne State University in Detroit, where he is the chairman of the philosophy department. He has several articles published in ethics, epistemology, and philosophy of religion. he has a book, manuscript, ready for publication, an introduction to philosophy through film. Please join me in welcoming both of our speakers this evening. Now, let me just say a few words about the format. Each speaker has up to 20 minutes for an opening presentation, 10 minutes for a rebuttal, and 5 minutes for a closing statement. But they can add on, if they don't use all their time, the 20 minutes, say, for the opening statement, or all of the 10 for the second, they can accumulate time. That's the unique thing about this format. As defending the prose side, Professor Craig will go first, and then Professor Russell will follow, and then Professor Craig will give a rebuttal, followed by Professor Russell. Did I say that right? Craig, and then it's going to be Craig, Russell, Craig, Russell, Craig, Russell, all the way. And then at the time at the end, this should take about a little more than an hour, we calculate. And afterwards, we'll have about a half an hour left for questions and answers before you have time for informal discussion with the speakers afterwards. So without further ado, let me present to you Professor Craig.
Thank you, and good evening. I want to begin by saying what a privilege I consider it to be addressing members of the Corps this evening. In the perilous times in which we live, my wife Jan and I are acutely aware of the debt that we owe to our men and women in the armed services, and we just want to say thank you for the sacrificial service that you're rendering to our country. Thank you very much. Now, for the question this evening, does God exist? In order to answer that question rationally, we've got to address two further questions. First, what good reasons are there to think that God exists? And secondly, what good reasons are there to think that God does not exist? Now, I'll leave it up to Bruce Russell to present the evidence against God's existence. In my opening speech, I want to sketch briefly 6 lines of evidence that weigh in favor of God's existence. Number 1, God is the best explanation of why something exists rather than nothing. This is the deepest question of philosophy. Why does anything at all exist instead of just nothing? Experience teaches that anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in its own nature or else in an external cause. You see, anything that exists is either one of 2 types. The first type is something that exists necessarily by its own nature. Example? Well, many mathematicians believe that numbers and other abstract objects exist in this way. If such entities exist, they just exist necessarily, without any cause of their being. The other type is anything that has an external cause of its existence. Examples? Mountains, planets, galaxies, and people. They have causes outside themselves which explain why they exist. Now, it's obvious that the universe exists. It therefore follows that the universe has an explanation of its existence. But what sort of explanation is it? Well, it seems plausible that if the universe has an explanation of its existence, that explanation is an external, personal, transcendent cause. Why? Because in this case, the cause must be greater than the universe. Think of the universe, all of space and time. So the cause of the universe must be beyond space and time. Therefore, it cannot be physical or material. Now, there are only 2 kinds of things that fit that description. Either abstract objects, like numbers, or else an intelligent mind. But abstract objects can't cause anything. Therefore, it follows that the explanation of the universe is an external, transcendent, personal cause, which is what everybody means by God. Number 2, God's existence is implied by the origin of the universe. The atheist could try to escape the argument I just gave by saying that the universe exists necessarily by its own nature. But this second argument blocks that escape route. For anything that exists necessarily must exist eternally. Think about it. If a thing ever came into existence or ceased to exist, then we know that its non-existence is possible. That is to say, it doesn't exist necessarily. In one of the most startling developments of modern science, we now have pretty strong evidence that the universe is not eternal in the past, but had an absolute beginning about 13 billion years ago in a cataclysmic event known as the Big Bang. What makes the Big Bang so startling is that it represents the origin of the universe from literally nothing. For all matter and energy, even physical space and time themselves, came into being at the Big Bang. As the British physicist P.C.W. Davies explains, the coming into being of the universe, as discussed in modern science, is not just a matter of imposing some sort of organization upon a previous incoherent state, but literally the coming into being of all physical things from nothing. This description holds not only for the standard Big Bang model, but also for quantum gravity models, like that of the famous physicist Stephen Hawking. Thus, Hawking reports in his book, The Nature of Space and Time, almost everyone now believes that the universe and time itself had a beginning at the Big Bang. Not only does this imply that the universe is not necessary in its existence, but it also raises the inevitable question, why? Why did the universe come into being 13 billion years ago? What brought the universe into existence? Well, unless you're prepared to say that the universe just popped into being uncaused out of absolutely nothing, there must be a transcendent cause beyond space and time which created the universe. Thus, from one, everything that begins to exist or comes into being has a cause, and two, the universe came into being, it follows logically that therefore the universe has a cause. Now, as the cause of space and time, this being must be a timeless, spaceless, immaterial being of unfathomable power. Moreover, it must be personal as well. I've already given one reason why this cause must be personal. Let me give another. If the cause were an impersonal set of necessary and sufficient conditions, then how could a timeless cause give rise to a temporal effect like the universe? If the cause were just an impersonal state, then that cause could never exist without its effect. If the cause were timelessly present, then the effect would be timelessly present as well. The only way for the cause to be timeless and for the effect to begin to exist in time is if the cause is a personal agent who freely chooses to create a new effect in time without any antecedent determining conditions. And thus we're brought not merely to a transcendent cause of the universe, but to its personal creator. Number three, the fine-tuning of the universe for intelligent life points to a designer of the universe. In recent decades, scientists have been stunned by the discovery of how delicate and complex a balance of the initial conditions of the universe are necessary in order for human life or intelligent life at all to exist in this universe. This fine-tuning is of two sorts. First, when the laws of nature are given expression as mathematical equations, you find appearing in them certain constants, like the gravitational constant. These constants are not determined by the laws of nature. The laws of nature are consistent with a wide range of values for these constants. Second, in addition to these constants, there are certain arbitrary quantities which are just put in as initial conditions on which the laws of nature operate. For example, the amount of entropy, or the balance between matter and antimatter in the universe. Now, all of these constants and quantities fall into an extraordinarily narrow, I cannot convey to you how almost infinitesimal this is, an extraordinarily narrow range of life-permitting values. Were these constants or quantities to be altered by even a hair's breadth, the life-permitting balance would be destroyed and life would not exist. For example, if the atomic weak force or the force of gravity were altered by even as much as 1 part out of 10 to the 100th power, the universe would not have been life-permitting. Now, there are only 3 possible explanations of this extraordinary fine-tuning: either physical necessity, chance, or design. Now, it can't be due to physical necessity because, as we've seen, the constants and quantities are independent of the laws of nature. So could the fine-tuning be due to chance? Well, the problem with this alternative is that the odds against the fine-tunings occurring by accident are so incomprehensibly great that they cannot reasonably be faced. The probability that all the constants and quantities would fall by chance alone into the life-permitting range is vanishingly small. We now know that life-prohibiting universes are vastly, incomprehensibly more probable than any life-permitting universe like this one. So, if the universe were the product of chance, the odds are overwhelming that the universe would be life-prohibiting. Hence, the fine-tuning is not due to either physical necessity or chance. But logically, that implies, therefore, it is due to design. And thus, the fine-tuning of the universe implies the existence of a designer of the cosmos. Number 4, objective moral values are plausibly grounded in God. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. By objective moral values, I mean moral values which are valid and binding, whether anybody believes in them or not. Many theists and atheists agree that if God does not exist, then moral values are not objective in this way. Michael Roos, who is a noted philosopher of science, explains, the position of the modern evolutionist is that morality is a biological adaptation, no less than our hands and feet and teeth. Considered as a rationally justifiable set of claims about an objective something, ethics is illusory. I appreciate that when somebody says, "Love thy neighbor as thyself," they think they are referring above and beyond themselves. Nevertheless, such reference is truly without foundation. Morality is just an aid to survival and reproduction, and any deeper meaning is illusory. Friedrich Nietzsche, the great 19th century atheist who proclaimed the death of God, understood that the death of God meant the destruction of all meaning and value in life. I think that Friedrich Nietzsche was right. But we've got to be very careful here. The question here is not, must we believe in God in order to live moral lives? I'm not claiming that we must. Nor is the question, must we believe in God in order to recognize objective moral values? I don't think that we do. Rather, the question is, if God does not exist, do objective moral values exist? Like Professor Roos, I just don't see any reason to think that in the absence of God, the herd morality evolved by Homo sapiens on this planet is objective. On the atheistic view, some action, say rape, may not be socially advantageous, and so in the course of human development has become taboo. But that does absolutely nothing to prove that rape is really wrong. On the atheistic view, there's nothing really wrong with your raping someone. And thus, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. But the problem is that objective values do exist, and deep down I think we all know it. There is no more reason to deny the objectivity of moral values than the objective reality of the physical world. Actions like rape, cruelty, and child abuse aren't just socially unacceptable behavior, they're moral abominations. As Roos himself admits, the man who says it is morally acceptable to rape little children is just as mistaken as the man who says 2 + 2 = 5. Some things are really wrong. Similarly, love, equality, and self-sacrifice are really good. Hence, I think that we all know that objective values do exist. But then it follows logically and inescapably that therefore God exists. Number 5, the historical facts concerning the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. The historical person Jesus of Nazareth was a remarkable individual. New Testament critics have reached something of a consensus that the historical Jesus came on the scene with an unheard of claim to divine authority, the authority to stand and speak in God's place. He claimed that in himself the kingdom of God had come, and as visible demonstrations of this fact, he carried out a ministry of miracle working and exorcisms. But the supreme confirmation of his claim was his resurrection from the dead. If Jesus really did rise from the dead, then we have a divine miracle on our hands, and thus evidence for the existence of God. Now, most people would probably think that the resurrection of Jesus is something you just believe in by faith or not. But actually, there are 3 established facts recognized by the majority of New Testament scholars today, which I believe are best explained by the resurrection of Jesus. Fact number 1, on the Sunday morning following the crucifixion, Jesus' tomb was discovered empty by a group of his women followers. According to Jakob Kramer, an Austrian specialist in the study of the resurrection, by far, most scholars hold firmly to the reliability of the biblical statements about the empty tomb. Fact number 2, on separate occasions, different individuals and groups of people experienced appearances of Jesus alive after his death. According to the prominent New Testament critic of Vanderbilt University, Gerhard Ludemann, it may be taken as historically certain that the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. These appearances were witnessed not only by believers, but also by skeptics, unbelievers, and even enemies. Fact number 3, the original disciples suddenly came to believe in Jesus' resurrection despite having every predisposition to the contrary. You see, Jews had no belief in a dying, much less rising, Messiah. And Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anyone's rising from the dead before the end of the world. Nevertheless, the original disciples came to believe so strongly in Jesus' resurrection that they were willing to die for the truth of that belief. N.T. Wright, an eminent British scholar, concludes, that is why, as an historian, I cannot explain the rise of early Christianity unless Jesus rose again, leaving an empty tomb behind him. Attempts to explain away these 3 great facts, like Jesus wasn't really dead or the disciples stole the body, have been universally rejected by contemporary scholarship. The fact is that there just is no plausible naturalistic explanation of these 3 facts. And therefore, it seems to me that the Christian is amply justified in believing that Jesus rose from the dead and was who he claimed to be. But that entails that God exists. And thus we have a good inductive argument for the existence of God based on the resurrection of Jesus. First, there are 3 established facts about Jesus: the empty tomb, the post-mortem appearances, and the origin of the disciples' belief. 2, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead is the best explanation of these facts. 3, the hypothesis God raised Jesus from the dead entails that God exists, for therefore God exists. Finally, number 6, you can experience God personally. This isn't really an argument for God's existence. Rather, it's the claim that you can know that God exists, wholly apart from arguments, simply by immediately experiencing him. This was the way that people in the Bible knew God. As Professor John Hick explains, God was known to them as a dynamic will interacting with their own wills, a sheer given reality, as inescapably to be reckoned with as destructive storm and life-giving sunshine. To them, God was not an idea adopted by the mind, but an experienced reality which gave significance to their lives. Now, if this is the case, then there's a real danger that arguments for God's existence could actually distract our attention from God himself. If you're sincerely seeking God, then God will make his existence evident to you. The Bible promises, draw near to God, and he will draw near to you. We mustn't so concentrate on the external arguments that we fail to hear the inner voice of God speaking to our own hearts. For those who listen, God becomes an immediate reality in their lives. In conclusion, then, we've seen 6 reasons to think that God exists. If Bruce wants us to believe atheism instead, then he's got to first tear down all 6 of the reasons I presented for God's existence, and then in their place erect a case of his own to prove that atheism is true. Unless and until he does that, I think we can agree that belief in God is the more plausible worldview.
Thank you very much. Now, Professor Russell.
Pleased to be back at West Point. I was here last year. Some of you might have heard me. I talked about the problem of evil, and I'll talk about the problem of evil again tonight. Also, it's a pleasure to engage in debate with Bill Craig again. We had a debate about 11 years ago in 1992 in Pontiac, Michigan, and I'm sure that both of us have thought about this issue some more since then, and I'll try to give you my recent thoughts about these things. The God of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is an all-knowing, all-powerful, holy, good person. There's one central argument against the existence of such a God, the problem of evil. It might more appropriately be called the problem of suffering, because the basic idea is that an all-knowing, all-powerful, holy, good being would not allow certain instances, types, or amounts of suffering, or would not allow it to be distributed in certain ways. My version of the argument says that God would not allow innocent people to suffer as much and as terribly as they have. In its simplest form, the argument goes as follows. First premise, if God exists, then there's no pointless suffering. That is, no suffering it would be morally indefensible for him to allow. Second premise, but there is pointless suffering, that is, suffering that it would be morally indefensible for God to allow. And of course, it follows from these 2 premises that God does not exist. I think the theist will agree with me that the first premise in this argument is true. No doubt he will argue that God can allow some suffering, say in order to allow people to exercise their free will and develop their moral character. But the theist will agree that God will not allow pointless or morally indefensible suffering, for God is wholly good. It is not possible for an all-knowing, all-powerful, wholly good being to allow any morally indefensible suffering just because that being is wholly good. So the theist will argue against the second premise, the one that says that there is pointless suffering, that is, suffering it would be wrong for God to allow. Here's my argument for the second premise. There are cases we read about every day in the newspapers where young children have been beaten, raped, tortured, and killed. Surely it would be wrong of a good parent to allow that to happen to her children if she knew about it and could easily prevent it. It would be no adequate defense of her failure to intervene to say that she did not want to interfere with the free will or moral development of the person who did all those awful things to her child. It would be no defense even if the criminal was her own child. Since God is all-knowing, he knows what is happening to all of his children. And since he is all-powerful, he can easily prevent the rape, beating, torture, and murder of innocent children. As we see from the example of the good parent, concern for the free will and the moral development of the person who committed the heinous crimes is not sufficient to justify non-intervention. The theist might respond that although the child suffers when God does not intervene to prevent it, she is taken up to heaven where she will experience eternal blessedness in the presence of God. So given the great benefit she will enjoy, it would not be wrong of God to allow her to suffer, knowing the benefit will follow. Two replies can be made to this defense. First, if that is the defense of God's failure to intervene, it should also be a defense of the mother's failure to intervene. Why can't she argue, at least to theists, that I did not want to interfere with the free will of the perpetrator, and my innocent child will be taken up to heaven where she will experience eternal blessedness at the hand of God. So all things considered, it was best for me not to intervene. Second, even if the young child is taken into heaven, why allow her to undergo that terrible experience? God could have taken her to heaven directly without her having to endure the fear, pain, and anxiety she did at the hands of that monster. It would be wrong of a good parent to allow her child to have her teeth drilled without an anesthetic when one is readily available. In general, it's wrong to allow needless suffering. And the suffering of the child, who was brutally raped, beaten, and murdered, was needless. God could have provided eternal blessedness to her without the suffering. To this, the theist might reply, but if God always intervened in cases like this, no one would ever have real freedom. Maybe people would have the freedom to mow the lawn or not, to watch this movie rather than that, to sleep in rather than to go to class or to work. But they would not have the freedom to make an important difference in the world, to do real good or evil. And it's a good thing for people to have real freedom. It's not clear to me that it is such a good thing to have what is here called real freedom. As good parents, we do not think it is a good thing for our children to have such real freedom. We think it better that we intervene to prevent our teenage son from hitting his little brother with a hammer than to allow him to have real freedom in this sense. We think it a good thing to have the freedom to do good or to fail to do good, but not to do good or great evil. It's better to have someone around to prevent attempts to do great evil, and better for that person to intervene when an attempt is made to do great evil than to stand idly by and let it occur. But suppose I grant for the sake of argument that God could allow that some exercises of free will that will have terrible consequences. From that, it does not follow that he would allow all the terrible suffering of innocence that we actually see in the world. Maybe a holy good being would allow people on occasion to do great harm to innocent others, say so everyone would get the idea that they have it in their power to make themselves into saints or monsters. Still, God would not have to allow so much suffering for people to get this idea. There have been millions of innocent children who have suffered in Hitler's Germany, Stalin's Russia, Pol Pot's Cambodia, and in Rwanda. Whatever idea God might be trying to impart by allowing terrible suffering, he could have done it by allowing much less. So there is gratuitous suffering, suffering that there is no sufficient reason for God to allow. At this point, the theist might charge me with hubris. He might ask, how do you know that there is no sufficient reason for God to allow all the terrible suffering we've seen in the world? Where were you when God created the heavens and the earth? Well, of course, I must admit that it's possible that God exists and has reasons beyond my and everyone's ken for allowing all the terrible suffering we see. My argument is simply that none of us sees a sufficient reason why so much of this suffering would be allowed by an all-knowing, all-powerful, holy good being. There are two possible explanations of this failure on our part to see such a reason. One, because there is none. And two, because there is one, but it's beyond our ken, that is, beyond our comprehension given our finite minds. My contention is that one is the best explanation of why we do not see a point to so much suffering. We do not see one because there is none. Suppose you hold the opposite. That is, suppose you hold two, that we don't see a point because the point is beyond our comprehension. Then I claim you'll be forced to say something similar in a case where saying that is absurd. Here's the case. We look around the world and see signs that the earth and the rest of the universe is very old. On Earth, we see deep river valleys, fossils, lava flows, and the like. We think that the best explanation of what we see is that over years and years, the flow of water has worn deep valleys into the landscape, that the fossils are the remains of creatures that existed many, many years ago, and that the lava flows came from now extinct volcanoes that erupted many years ago. Hence, the earth must be very old. However, there's a competing explanation that says that God created the earth fairly recently, say 100 years or even 5 minutes ago, with these apparent signs of age. He also created apparent histories of mankind, which include tales of good and evil and of good conquering evil. Perhaps he did this because he thought we could learn from these tales, and it would be better to learn from such fictions than to have people actually suffer. To those who say this is not a good reason for God to deceive us, and that we see no good reason why God would deceive us in this way, the defenders of the recent creation theory reply that there are two possible explanations of the apparent signs of age. One star, the earth really is about as old as most scientists think. Or two star, it was recently created by God, and he deceives us about its age for reasons beyond our ken, that is, beyond our comprehension. I claim that we should accept the first explanation and reject the second. We should believe that the earth is pretty old, not that it was created very recently by a God who deceives us about its age for reasons beyond our grasp. But if that is true, then we should believe that the reason we see no point to so much terrible suffering is that there is none, and not that God allows it for reasons beyond our ken. In both cases, the simplest, and so the best explanation, is the one that does not appeal to reasons beyond our ken or comprehension. If you reject the recent creation hypothesis, was created 100 years ago or 5 minutes ago, to explain the apparent signs of age of Earth, then you must also reject the theistic hypothesis to explain apparently pointless suffering. I've now argued for the second premise and the main argument against God that I gave at the outset. I have argued that it's reasonable to believe that there is pointless suffering. That is, suffering it would be morally indefensible for God to allow if he existed. Hence, he does not exist. I believe that Dr. Craig will argue that we should believe that God exists. Well, he has. Hence, he will use my first premise that says, if God exists, there's no pointless suffering. He will use that premise with the claim that God exists to show that there is really no pointless suffering, despite appearances to the contrary. So in the end, I think this debate will turn on whose argument is strongest, Craig's for the existence of God, or mine for the existence of pointless suffering. In the rebuttal, I will try to criticize his arguments for the existence of God, 6 he gave today. No doubt in his rebuttal, he will try to criticize mine for the existence of pointless suffering. I believe, is what it will boil down to.
Well, Bruce is right about one thing. I will criticize his argument from pointless suffering. You remember that argument goes as follows. If God exists, then pointless suffering does not exist. But pointless suffering does exist, and therefore God does not exist. Now, in responding to this objection, I think it's critical that we distinguish between what we might call the emotional problem and the intellectual problem. Pain and suffering in the world are undoubtedly a tremendous emotional obstacle to belief in God for many people. But that does not mean that it is automatically, therefore, a good intellectual objection to God's existence. However emotionally difficult evil and suffering might make it to believe in God, I'm convinced that it's not a good intellectual objection to God's existence. Well, why do I say that? Well, first of all, notice that Dr. Russell's objection depends, as he says, on the assumption that we have no good reasons to think that God exists. In his 1996 article, Dr. Russell admits that if we have good reasons to think God exists, then we have good reason to think that the evil in the world is not really pointless. So the suffering in the world is a problem intellectually only for someone who has no good reason to believe in God. But I've given 6 reasons to believe in God. And if these are good reasons, then Dr. Russell's argument can't even get off the ground by his own admission. But suppose I'm wrong about that. Suppose we have no good reason to believe in God's existence. Will Russell's objection still go through? Well, I don't think so. Why not? Well, in the first place, the second premise that pointless suffering exists is controversial. You see, we're just not in a good position to judge whether the evil we observe in the world is truly pointless. The philosopher William Alston, in his article, The Inductive Problem of Evil, lists 6 limitations on us which make it impossible to judge that God has no good reasons for permitting evil. Take just one of them. Our being limited in time and space. God's morally sufficient reasons for allowing some evil to enter our life might not emerge until centuries from now, or maybe in another country. When you contemplate our temporal and spatial limitations, I think you can see how hopeless it is for finite beings to speculate on the probability of God having a morally sufficient reason for permitting this or that evil that has entered their lives. And therefore, I think that the case of suffering is qualitatively distinct from our belief in the reality of the past. Alston concludes, and I quote, "It is impossible in principle for us to be justified in supposing that God does not have sufficient reasons for permitting evil." But moreover, I think premise 1, under at least one interpretation, is not clearly true either. That is to say, the premise that if God exists, then pointless suffering does not exist. Maybe only in a world containing pointless suffering would the maximum number of people freely come to know God and find eternal life. I think that the reason that we think God would prevent pointless evil is because we think God, if he exists, is there to create a comfortable environment for his human pets. But on the Christian worldview, that's false. We are not God's pets. And the purpose of life is not human happiness as such, but rather knowing God and eternal life. And many evils may occur which are utterly pointless with respect to producing human happiness, but they may be justly permitted in view of God's overall purpose. Now, Dr. Russell might say, well, then they aren't pointless. They are morally defensible. But if that's what you mean by pointless, morally indefensible, that makes it all the more impossible to prove that these evils truly are morally indefensible if they serve God's broader purpose of bringing people to know him ultimately and to bring them to eternal life. My last point I'd like to make is that I think that evil paradoxically actually proves the existence of God. My argument would go like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. 2, evil exists. 3, therefore, objective moral values exist. That is to say, some things are really evil, therefore, God exists. Thus, although evil and suffering at one level seem to call into question God's existence, on a deeper, more fundamental level, they actually prove God's existence. So although the suffering in the world may constitute a significant emotional obstacle to belief in God, at the end of the day, I do not think that it constitutes a significant intellectual objection against God's existence.
It's true I said in this article that Dr. Craig referred to that if there were good reason to believe that God exists, then I think it would follow that there really isn't pointless suffering. It just appears that way. It's basically what I said in my last paragraph of my opening remarks. Of course, it has to be the case that there are better reasons to believe God exists than to believe that pointless suffering exists. So even if there were some, but they weren't as strong as the reason to believe that pointless suffering exists, all things considered, we still should believe that God doesn't exist. But I think that's why it's crucial for me to go through Dr. Craig's arguments to show that there is reason to believe that God exists. And the first one that he gave was about everything must have an explanation, and so there are only two kinds of explanations. Either it's in the nature of things or there must be some sort of cause. And I don't disagree with that. The question is, what's the case? What is it that's being explained? What is it that requires a cause? And in his second argument, he focuses on the existence of the universe itself. He says it's something which has come into existence, and therefore he holds that whatever has come into existence must have a cause. The universe has come into existence. It follows it must have a cause. And that conclusion, of course, does follow from the premises. The question is, what does the conclusion establish, really? It doesn't actually establish that there's an all-knowing, all-powerful, holy, good God. It just establishes that there's some kind of cause of the universe. And Dr. Craig ruled out the possibility that there's an impersonal cause or that the universe is a necessary existent or being, and let them be ruled out for the sake of argument. But still it leaves it open that a devil could have been the cause of the universe and not God, because it speaks not at all to the moral properties or even the omniscience of the supposed personal creator of the universe. So the conclusion you get from this cosmological argument really isn't the conclusion that God, as understood in Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, exists. It's something less than that. Furthermore, suppose you try to argue it is a personal being. The question is, well, what about this personal being? Did it exist in time and forever in time? There's other arguments that Dr. Craig has given in other places that suggest that that's not possible. So in other places he said that God is timeless, doesn't exist in time, but brings the universe into being and time into being. The thing is, suppose God exists timelessly and has then a timeless intention to create the universe. Still, he needs some volition, he needs some act of will, because otherwise if he had a timeless intention, was always operative, then the universe would timelessly exist too. So there must be some volition, some act of will. But what about this act of will? Is it timeless? Well, it better be. If it came into existence itself, then it must have a cause by the very first premise of his argument, that everything that comes into existence has a cause. The act of volition must have a cause too. And then the cause of that must have a cause, and we're off to the races with an infinite regress of causes of the volition. On the other hand, if it's not something, the volition isn't something that comes into existence but existed timelessly, then I don't see how the universe could fail to exist timelessly too. Timeless God, timeless intention, timeless volition, then you have a created universe timelessly. So I think the problem is it doesn't really explain the coming into existence of the universe if you carry out the strand of this argument. The other argument he gives is a fine-tuning argument that there are certain physical constants that if they were only slightly different, we wouldn't have life, we wouldn't have intelligent life, any of that stuff wouldn't happen. It's very unlikely that you would have a universe with those constants that support life. I agree. The question is, what follows from this unlikelihood? He thinks that chance isn't an answer. I'm not convinced it's not an answer. You know, if you have a million-ticket lottery, suppose here's the way it's arranged, that if you draw the number 2, which is the only even prime, they don't kill you. But if you draw any other number, the Society of Even Prime Lovers kills you. You draw 2. What's the best explanation? I think the best explanation is chance. You could have drawn 93 or 943,113 or any of the other tickets between 1 and a million in this million-ticket lottery. You happen to draw 2, you're a lucky devil, but it doesn't require anything else than chance to explain you're drawing 2. Suppose you don't accept that. Suppose you don't think that's a good reply. Here's another one. I call it the balls fall down argument. Balls fall down when you drop them. But if the wind was slightly different, they wouldn't fall straight down. They'd fall to the left or the right. If it was really strong, they might fall up, so to speak, fall up. They could go straight out to the left or the right. There's an infinite number of ways a ball could fall if the wind were just slightly different. And that the wind be the way it is not some kind of law of nature. And so there's an infinite number of ways. It's quite amazing of these infinite number of ways that the ball could fall, that it fell down. What's the probability? It's minuscule. It's even smaller than the probability that the universe would support life. So the conclusion of this argument is there must be some intelligent being, some personal being that prevents the wind from going the way it is, and so that balls fall down when balls do fall down. But of course we think that argument's absurd. I mean, why accept that argument? But to me, the structure of the balls fall down argument is exactly the same structure as the fine-tuning argument. Objective moral values, he's argued before and argued tonight the following way, that if God doesn't exist, there are no objective values. But there are objective values as a second premise in this argument, so God exists. I accept the second premise. I believe there are objective values. I deny the first. I don't think it's true that if God doesn't exist, there are no objective values. I think whether or not God exists, that rape is wrong, that it's wrong to torture kids for the fun of it, that it's wrong to lie or cheat or steal for personal gain. How come? What's the deal here? What can the atheist say about morality? There are lots of views of morality that are compatible with atheism that hold that they're objective values. One says that they're just necessary truths. They're necessary moral truths, just like the truth that no object can be red and green all over at the same time in the same respects. It's a necessary truth. It's also a necessary truth that it's wrong to torture kids for the fun of it. In every possible world, even in worlds, if possible, where God doesn't exist, it's wrong. There's a view, an atheist view of objective moral value. Another one says, hey, you know, it's not what people actually agree on that determines morality. It's what they would agree on if they were equally situated with respect to one another. If they had roughly equal power, and so on and so forth. The rules that they would agree on for social cooperation under those conditions determine the moral rules, not under actual conditions, but under hypothetical conditions. That determines what's right or wrong. And people could evolve so that they actually adhere to rules that would be chosen under hypothetical, not under actual conditions, but it happens to be the case that evolution supports the same rules that would be chosen under hypothetical conditions. So I don't accept in this argument the claim, the conditional, that says if God doesn't exist, there are no objective values. I think there are objective values whether or not God exists. The next argument he gives is one from the historical facts about Jesus. He says there are three facts. There's the empty tomb. On Sunday following the crucifixion, the tomb was discovered empty. There's the fact that Jesus appeared to various people, believers, unbelievers, skeptics, enemies, at times after his death. And thirdly, there's the fact that people who were Jews actually became Christians, even though this was quite contrary to many of their strongly held beliefs. Well, I don't know, I don't mean to be offensive, but here's an analogy I thought about when I was thinking about this for tonight. When I was in Memphis, Tennessee in 1977 in the summer, and Elvis Presley died. And what if somebody said to you, remember these are reports of reports. People say that people said. So they report that people said that Elvis was not in the coffin. And everybody agrees he was not in the coffin. And people all over the country report having seen Elvis. Some people didn't really like Elvis. You know, they said, geez, we saw him, at McDonald's. And then furthermore, there are people who were really opposed to Elvis, didn't like his music, thought it was corrupting the youth, so on and so forth. They became Elvis lovers. Now, what should you believe, given these three facts about Elvis? I don't think you should believe that Elvis actually was alive, and he existed after what was thought to be his death. At most, you should be skeptical. I think probably you should disbelieve, but at most you should say, geez, man, I don't know, the enemies, they came over, they didn't like rock and roll, and they still said that they saw Elvis. just don't know how to explain this, but you shouldn't. There's not sufficient evidence for you to actually believe that Elvis survived what was thought to be his death. The last one about personal experience of God. I don't doubt here either that people have had experiences that they believed were encounters with God. But of course, people have experiences that they believe are encounters with their deceased relatives and loved ones. The question is about religious experience, not that people sincerely and genuinely and deeply believe that they've encountered God. The question is, what's the best explanation of these experiences? And I think in the case of, we all think that in the case of people who say they've encountered their dead mother or whatever, relative or loved one or so on and so forth, the best explanation is psychological, not that their mother or loved one or so on actually exists. So those are my responses to Dr. Craig's 6 arguments. I'll respond to his criticism of the problem of evil when I get my final remarks.
Oh, okay.
And you have 5 more of them.
Oh, okay. Very good. In my closing statement, let me attempt to draw together some of the threads in this evening's debate and see if we can draw some conclusions. First, have we heard compelling reasons to think that God does not exist? Well, I don't think so. The only argument against God's existence that's been offered this evening is the problem of pointless suffering. But I argued against that first of all, we're simply not in a good position to judge with any sort of confidence whether or not God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting some act of suffering to enter our lives. Given our finitude in time and space, as well as other limitations upon us, we simply cannot know whether or not some act of suffering that comes into our lives wouldn't be justly permitted by God. Secondly, I also suggested that it may well be the case that only in a world in which there is pointless suffering that the optimal number of people would come to know God and find eternal life. God's overall purpose in life is not just to make us happy in this life. It's to draw people into relationship with Himself and to bring them into the kingdom of God forever. And it may well be the case, honestly, I think this is not at all improbable, that only in a world involving a great deal of natural and moral evil, much of which it appears pointless, that the optimal number of people would freely come into God's kingdom and come to know Him. So I just don't have any confidence at all intellectually in this objection. Finally, I argued as well that evil itself proves that God exists. If you'll agree with me that in the absence of God, that everything becomes socioculturally relative, that there is no absolutes left anymore without God, then it follows from the existence of genuine moral evil that God exists. So, are there good reasons to think that God exists, apart from the evil in the world, which I think actually is an argument for God's existence? Well, first I argued, based upon the argument from existence, that everything that exists has an explanation. The universe exists. If the universe has an explanation, it is an external, transcendent, personal cause, which is what everyone means by God. Here, Dr. Russell agreed with my main premise, but he simply questioned whether or not this had any theistic significance. Well, most certainly it does. This first argument, even if the universe never had a beginning, even if it's eternal, the question is, what is the explanation for the existence of an eternal universe? It must be a being which is beyond space and time, therefore immaterial, and therefore personal, as I argued. So this first argument gives you a personal, timeless, spaceless, immaterial, and unbelievably powerful being that created the universe, which I think is the core concept of God. Secondly, what about the argument from the beginning of the universe? I argued that everything that begins to exist has a cause, and that the universe began to exist as shown by contemporary cosmology. Here, Dr. Russell really didn't disagree with either of the premises and therefore with the conclusion, but he just complained that you haven't proven that this being is all-powerful and all good. Well, granted, I've only proven that he is so powerful that he can create the universe out of nothing. Now, that may not be omnipotence, but it comes about as close as you can get. As for being all good, that's given by my moral argument. I'm building a cumulative case here, and the moral argument gives us the all goodness of God. So I think we do have good grounds for thinking that such a being exists. Look, it would be a strange form of atheism which says, yes, there is a personal, transcendent, spaceless, timeless, immaterial being of unbelievable power who has created the universe. That would be a strange sort of atheism, and yet that's what Dr. Russell has been willing to concede here. He does give an argument against the personhood of the first cause by saying you would need to have an act of will and not just a timeless intention in order to create the world. Actually, I agree with that, but I'm appealing here to what philosophers call agent causation. That is to say, you get to an agent endowed with free will who can simply freely will a new effect without having any antecedent determining conditions. So that stops the infinite regress. If you say there has to be an infinite regress, that would prove that none of us can be agent causes, that free will is impossible, because everything would have to be determined by prior causes. So if you believe in, as I do, free will, I think you've got good grounds for accepting agent causation, and that will give you a free personal creator of the universe who can bring the universe into being out of nothing. The third argument from the fine-tuning of the universe, I said is the fine-tuning is due to either chance, necessity, or design. And Dr. Russell didn't agree that the universe is incredibly fine-tuned for the intelligent life, but he wants to say that it's due to chance, and he gives the example of a lottery. Well, now, the correct lottery example you should use would be one like this: a lottery in which a billion black balls are mixed together with one white ball, and you're told you've got to reach in and pick out a ball. And unless you pick the white ball, you will be shot. Now, any ball you pick is equally improbable. That's true in his balls example. Any ball you pick is equally improbable, but nevertheless, it is overwhelmingly more probable that whichever ball you pick, it will be black rather than white. And in exactly the same way, we're not trying to explain the probability of this universe existing, but of any life-permitting universe existing. And if this were due to just chance alone, then it is overwhelmingly more probable that it should be a life-prohibiting universe. The fact that it's not cries out for explanation, and that's why so many physicists today are explaining or exploring multiple universe scenarios to try to explain away the fine-tuning. Sober scientists don't beat themselves out the door to accept multiple universe scenarios, which are metaphysical, when there's nothing here that cries out for explanation. So I do think that this gives good grounds for thinking that the universe is not due to chance alone. The best explanation is a mind, a designer. What about my fourth argument, the moral argument? I argued here that if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Here Dr. Russell denies this by saying, well, moral truths are just necessary truths. But notice the assumption, I think, behind his objection is that if something is a necessary truth, it doesn't need an explanation, or it can't have an explanation. And that just doesn't follow. That's not obvious. In mathematics, theorems are necessarily true, but they're deduced from the axioms. So in mathematics, you have all kinds of explanatory hierarchies where something can be necessarily true, but it still has an explanation. So I agree that moral truths are necessary. That's my position as well. But what I'm saying is, why are they true? If there is no God, then look, we're just animals. We're just basically advanced primates, and animals don't have morality. So it's hard to see how human morality is objective on the evolutionary atheistic view. So it seems to me that if you do agree with me that objective moral values exist, and surely they do, that they need to be grounded in a transcendent anchor, a personal being which is the locus and source of absolute goodness and grounds moral values. Fifthly, the argument from the resurrection of Jesus. Notice that Dr. Russell didn't agree with the three facts that historians have determined about Jesus of Nazareth: his empty tomb, his resurrection appearances, and the origin of the Christian faith. But he compared these to Elvis sightings. Now, let's think about that. What are Elvis sightings? Well, I think that Elvis sightings, seriously, are either lies or they're hallucinations, right? But you can't explain the resurrection appearances of Jesus as either lies or hallucinations. No Elvis sighter has, to my knowledge, voluntarily gone to a tortuous death in attestation of the truth of his Elvis sighting. It is simply implausible to say that the appearance traditions in the Gospels were the result of deliberate lies. But neither are they the result of hallucinations. First of all, the diversity of the appearances belies the hallucination hypothesis. Jesus was seen multiple times to individuals as well as groups of people, to skeptics and unbelievers as well as believers. Nothing in the psychological case books parallels this. Secondly, belief in or hallucinations would not have led to belief in Jesus' resurrection. Given Jewish thought forms, it would have led to belief in his ascension into heaven, but not his resurrection. And finally, thirdly, hallucinations would still leave the empty tomb unexplained. You've got to conjoin some independent hypothesis to the hallucination hypothesis to explain the empty tomb. So the simpler, overarching explanation is the one that the original disciples gave, namely, God raised him from the dead. Finally, the personal experience of God. Here, Bruce says, well, people have all kinds of experiences, and many are non-veridical. Well, certainly that's true. But the question is, why should I deny my experience of God that I have unless I'm given some sort of defeater for that belief, unless I have a good argument for atheism or some reason to think that I'm deluded? And is that what Bruce thinks, that I and every other person who claims to have a personal experience of God is psychologically deluded? I'm not going to believe that unless he gives me some good reason psychologically to make me think that. But I'm willing to submit to any sort of test as to whether or not I'm a psychologically balanced person or not. If I might close on a personal note in this regard, I myself wasn't raised in a Christian home or a church-going family. But as a junior in high school, I came to have a personal relationship with God through an experience of Jesus Christ as I read the New Testament and explored his claims. And if you're seeking for God and wanting to find him as a personal reality in your life, I just encourage you to do the same thing. Pick up a New Testament, read it. Ask yourself, could this really be the truth? Could God exist? Could he be knowable through his son, Jesus Christ? And I think that it could change your life in the same way that it changed mine.
I have 3 minutes for my closing statements. I'm going to talk fast. I guess the first thing I'll say is about the problem of evil. Dr. Craig says that we're in no good position to judge that there's pointless suffering. But my point about the recent creation hypothesis is that we would be in no better position to judge that the earth wasn't created 5 minutes ago or 100 years ago by God for reasons beyond our ken. We all think we are in a good position to judge that that hypothesis is false. So I don't think he addressed my parallel argument that I thought there was an analogy between the recent earth hypothesis and the hypothesis that God allows all this suffering, this terrible suffering for reasons beyond our ken. I don't think it's true that everything becomes socially relative if God doesn't exist. I don't see why there aren't objective moral values, as I said. He worried about their grounding, although at one point he said early in his arguments that you can give an explanation of things by referring to their nature, by which he then explained, like numbers, their nature is to necessarily exist if they exist. So I think it's the same way with truths like nothing can be red and green all over, or it's wrong to torture innocents for the fun of it. It doesn't matter whether God exists or not. Those mathematical and moral truths are true and don't require any further explanation. There might be another moral theory. There's lots of moral theories that have some. I guess in general, my concern is that there are competing explanations for all these phenomena, religious experiences, the supposed empty tombs, the sighting of Jesus, and so on and so forth. The fine-tuning argument, he didn't address my balls fall down argument that, all the possible ways that would go, and that I thought that was parallel to the other argument. So I think in general my conclusion is that at best you should be skeptical. There are lots of other competing hypotheses that are just as good to explain the phenomena that Dr. Craig focuses upon, and he has to actually show that his hypotheses are strictly better. I don't think he's done that, and I also think he hasn't actually addressed my parallel argument to the recent Earth hypothesis when I present the problem of evil. Thanks.
thank you both for a very stimulating, thought-provoking set of presentations. Now we have a little time for questions from you all. So if you have questions, raise your hand, and we have cadets with paddles to come around and identify you and let you ask your questions. There's, right there, okay. Cadet right in the middle. Right, Cadet Adams.
Gentleman Cadet Schmidt, this question is for Dr. Russell. Sir, in your opening statement, you made the claim that if suffering is needed on earth, that God can make it to the point where it's only needed, and that tragedies to the extent of Stalin's reign in Russia or the Holocaust are unneeded, where millions of people die. Sir, isn't that really all relative? For example, in the September 11th attacks, 3,000 people died. Many of us may claim only 300 people needed to die for us to get the point and make the necessary changes. But had 30,000 people died, couldn't we make the claim that only 3,000 needed to die? What quantitatively separates needed from unneeded suffering?
Yeah, I think there are questions that involve vague terms and predicates. So how few hairs does a person have to have on his head to be bald? Well, it's hard to say. But on the other hand, I know I shouldn't use that example, but clearly I'm not bald and the other people are. The point is there are clear cases, though. I mean, even if you can't draw the line sharply anywhere, there are clear cases where we know, for instance, that some people are bald and clearly some people are not, and then there are these cases in the middle about which there's disagreement. So what I was claiming, it's clearly over the top that there, even if we can't draw the line, we know there's much more than is needed. At least we can't think of any purpose for having so much suffering. And my general point is, so we don't see a point to it, and then there's the competing explanations. Well, why don't we see a point? And the two explanations are, there is none, or there is one beyond our ken. And then I said I thought the first one was simpler, and by analogy with the recent Earth hypothesis, the best explanation.
Yes, hello, sir. As I understand it, one of your measures were for the existence of God, that the examples of extreme devotion and or faith by early Jews to the conversion to Christianity is an example of the power of God. If that is the case, then what is the explanation for Buddhists willing to set themselves on fire, as they did in the Vietnam War, for a set of beliefs that are completely different than the Judeo-Christian or Islamic tradition?
If that were my argument, I think that your objection would be exactly on target and well taken, but it's important to understand what my argument was. I wasn't arguing that because the original disciples were devoted or zealous, that therefore what they said must be true. Zeal and devotion only shows, I think, that the person is not lying. It shows that the person really believes what he's claiming. People don't die for things that they know are false. So that both the Buddhists and the Christians and others do things because they really, really believe it. But that wasn't my argument. That would obviously be a bad argument. My argument was rather that the belief that God raised Jesus from the dead is a very un-Jewish idea, because Messiah, when he came, wasn't supposed to die a humiliating death of a criminal. There were lots of messianic movements in the century before and after Jesus, and the Romans typically dealt with all these would-be messiahs the same way. They crucified them. And when your favorite messiah got crucified, you basically had a choice. You either found yourself a new messiah or you went home. But nobody claimed that the crucified person really was the Messiah after all, and that God had raised him from the dead. Jewish beliefs about the afterlife precluded anybody's rising from the dead prior to the end of the world. And so my argument is that you have to find some explanation historically for the origin of this belief upon which the early Jesus movement depended. It wouldn't have originated without this belief. Where did they get this idea? And I think the best explanation is that Jesus really did rise from the dead.
Okay, back there.
Members of the Heaven's Gate cult believe that if they killed themselves by eating applesauce, they would join a spaceship behind the Hale-Bopp comet. If they really believe this, then where did these beliefs come from?
That's for me, that question? Well, I don't know the sociological origins of that Heaven's Gate cult, but I mean, in general, cultists come up with all kinds of kooky ideas, and you mustn't think that my argument, I think perhaps this is trying to get at the argument based on religious experience, justifies believing just in any kind of experience. I mean, obviously, there are non-veridical experiences, that is to say, mirages, hallucinations, delusions, and so forth. But what I'm saying is that for the person who has a personal experience of God, he's within his rational rights in believing that this is a veridical, authentic experience of God, unless he's got some good reason to think that he's in error. Now, clearly, somebody who thinks about eating applesauce, he's going to go off on a spaceship, has a very good reason for thinking that's a false belief. But I don't think that there are comparable good reasons for thinking that my experience of God, revealed in the Bible, is a delusion or a non-veridical belief. So, in the absence of some defeater of that experience, I think I'm perfectly rational to go on believing in God.
At one point during the debate, Dr. Craig's talked about how if there was no objective morality, humans would be just like animals. I was wondering if you could address whether or not animals have objective morality, and if not, how or what separates animals from humans as far as morality.
Yeah, you know, it was interesting. I was Daniel Dennis coming to Wayne State this Friday, so I was reading his book Freedom Evolves, which I have up here on the table, and he was trying to explain how freedom evolves and so on and so forth. And I happened to read in the Detroit Free Press about this experiment they did with monkeys, in which they had them perform this task, and they rewarded all the monkeys by giving them cucumbers, and then they differentially rewarded some of them, giving some of them grapes for doing the same task, and they liked grapes better than cucumbers apparently, and the monkeys went on strike, and some of them slowed down their work, you know, so it made me think, man, those monkeys have a sense of fairness. They were really indignant that the other ones got grapes and they got cucumbers. So I'm not sure whether there's not a sense of morality that goes down to the primates at least. But in response to, well, what's the difference? If you go low enough on the animal scale, I'll say that they don't have a morality. Well, I think also infant children don't have morality. That we don't blame them because we excuse them because we think they don't understand at a certain age the difference between right and wrong. So I think that's the way with the animals too. They don't have enough intelligence to understand the difference between right and wrong any more than they have enough intelligence to understand mathematics. But as normal people develop, they then develop enough intelligence to understand this phenomenon.
Are there other questions? Okay, back there.
Cadet Corbin, this is for Dr. Russell and his balls fall down theory. It seems overly simplistic to compare the creation of the universe to just say balls falling down. I mean, even when you step it up to say if you found a completely working Swiss-made watch on the side of the road, and you're saying that could be just put together by chance, it seems very hard to say that. What would be your response to that?
Tell me more about what's the deal about the watch. Tell me more about that.
Say you're just walking along the road in the middle of a desert and you found a working watch on the road. Seeing that watch would imply that there's a creator for that watch, that somebody made that watch and made it to work and made it the way it was. It didn't just fall together like that.
Okay, I got it now. My answer is that we have inductive evidence to support our belief that watches are things that were created by intelligent beings, namely intelligent human beings. So there's experience behind us. We have positive inductive evidence that those kinds of things, that specific kind of thing was created by some intelligent being. But this is strictly a probabilistic argument, the one from fine-tuning. It doesn't say we have had experience that these improbable things of this type were created by intelligence. It just says this is very improbable, so it must have been created by intelligence. So the reason I try to construct that parallel argument with balls fall down, it was merely probabilistic. So that was supposed to be the parallel. It's very improbable it'll fall straight down. My gosh, if a little gust of wind blew, it would go this way, that way. There's an infinite possible ways that a ball might fall. And so just probabilistically that it would fall down is very unlikely. So there must be some intelligent creator that made it fall down. But we think that that argument's absurd. But I don't see why the other argument, the fine-tuning argument, isn't a parallel argument and hence just as absurd.
You have a mic?
Sir, this is for Dr. Russell. I was just going to ask kind of a personal question. At what age did you begin your atheist belief, and was there an event or a specific happening that conduced you to believing in atheism?
I guess I'd have to look for an anti-religious experience to give you what you want. No, there was no experience, and it wasn't some particular event. I mean, I can remember having doubts in high school when I argued with my friends about these kinds of things, but I think as I became a philosopher and tried to think more and more about these arguments for and against, that finally I was convinced that the arguments for don't work, and there's this very powerful problem of evil argument against.
Over here.
Gentleman Cadet Rugarber. Sir, this is for Dr. Russell. Sir, how does the modern-day atheist justify modern-day miracles, such as the bleeding of statues and the prophecies of Fatima? And why, sir, do the statues only bleed normally of sculptures of divine figures and not, like, let's say, the statues outside here at West Point? Is that by chance, sir, or is there a design to that?
Are you asking me why they believe, or did these things, should I believe they really happen?
Well, sir, I'm asking for what the explanation is, sir, for that. Why do statues bleed, and why are the predictions of Fatima that came true? Is this by chance, sir, or is this by design?
No, I mean, I think that there's this thing I call the progress of science argument that's against miracles that goes, there used to be lots of phenomena that we couldn't explain and people thought they were miraculous, and then science progressed and we explained a lot of them. And so we have reason to believe that the unexplained phenomena also have a scientific explanation which we have not yet discovered.
Back there, John.
Russell, this is Cadet DeWanzik. You said that you think that without a God there can be an objective morality. Where would that be coming from? I mean, it couldn't really come from society because society has been wrong in the past, for instance, slavery and that sort of thing.
Societies, what? Say that again?
Where would the objective morality come from if it doesn't come from God?
Uh-huh. Well, I mean, what if I asked you a parallel question, though? Where does mathematics come from if it didn't come from God? Wouldn't you say that that was an ill-formed question? That there's some necessary mathematical truths that don't need to come from anywhere? I mean, it's kind of like the question, well, what makes ideas red or green or something? Well, it's for me a wrong, it's a category mistake to ask the question about where do they come from, and the way it is to ask about of any necessary truth, where does it come from? But one answer I did propose, I don't know if I actually think this is correct, but it's plausible, is that morality consists of the systems of rules that people who are impartially situated with respect to each other and roughly equal in power with respect to each other would agree to under those conditions. Not the actual conditions, but the ones they would agree to under hypothetical impartial conditions.
Sir, my question is for Dr. Craig, and actually I need more of a response than an answer. You said in your opening statement that everything exists either out of necessity or an external cause, and you failed to apply that to God himself. Does God exist out of necessity? And if so, what is that necessity? And if not, then he must be created from some external need. And I was just wondering what your thoughts are, and perhaps that is the need of man to explain unexplainable events.
principle requires us to get back to some sort of explanation of the universe, and this would be in some sort of a being which exists by a necessity of its own nature. Now, as I said, the only things that could exist in that way would be either abstract objects like numbers, which can't stand in causal relations to anything. Numbers don't cause anything. Or else an unembodied intelligent mind. And that's what I take God to be, that God is a necessary being. He exists by a necessity of his own nature, and he is a mind, if you will, an infinite, omniscient, unembodied mind who has created the universe and brought it into existence. And then my other arguments would try to show others of his attributes, like that he's morally perfect and has revealed himself in Christ and so forth. So basically that's the argument, is that we have to get to some sort of a necessary being, which is the explanation for why a universe exists.
All right, we have time for one more question before our time is up. There's a hand over here, John, if no one else.
My question, sir, is if we believe Dr. Craig and we're wrong, then nothing happens. If we believe Dr. Craig and we're wrong, then nothing happens. We just cease to exist. If we believe you and we're wrong, we risk going to hell. So why not just err on the side of Dr. Craig?
Yeah. I want to say first that one thing about the cosmological argument that I said was I would grant that it shows that there's an all-powerful being, but I didn't think it showed that that it showed that there's anything about an all-knowing being, and that the argument about objective values failed to show that the being was all good, so that at most it would establish one of the criteria of the creator. And if it turned out the creator was actually all evil, then you might have to worry about believing in him. But furthermore, my real answer to this question, this kind of Pascalian wager, is this wager argument, this pragmatic argument for belief in God, only works, is only plausible if you assume the payoff table you're assuming. Bertrand Russell thought that if he tried his darndest to believe or not believe in God, and he disbelieved, but God existed, God would actually reward him for making this effort and exercising his intellect, which God gave him, and would punish people who mindlessly believed in God. So it's not clear which way the pragmatic argument points. It all depends on what's reasonable to think about the payoff table that's presupposed.
Join me and thank both of our speakers. Thank you all. You're dismissed, and have a good evening. Well done.
Okay.
I had just